All right, thank you, Rob. And I'm going to ask folks to mute just so that our attention doesn't get pulled. And if you need help with muting or unmuting, just let any one of us who says, not all of us have our program committee thing in our name, but if we want to add it, there's plenty of us here to ask. At the very least, you can hit Rob or me or Stevie up and we'll help you out. And so I am very excited and delighted to introduce you all to Maida Owens, who is a folklorist and is zooming in from Louisiana with us today. And I had the honor of seeing half a workshop because then my sound cut out. So that's why I'm extra excited to get more today. A workshop that Maida offered through the Folkloric Society in New York City. And I think we have a wonderful hour and a half or so ahead of us, where we also hope that folks will be involved. I'm going to let Maida do a little more introduction of herself, but I just wanted to set the stage and say welcome, Maida, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's workshop.
Well, thank you. Yes, I am UU. I am coming in from Baton Rouge, and at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge is my home church. So I was especially pleased to get this invitation. I thought this was exciting to be able to speak to all of you UUs. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat today. I want to share with you some let me see, let me get my screen up. There we go. Okay. Today, what I want to do is talk to y'all about an aspect concerning climate change that doesn't get talked about near as much as I would like it to be. I'm going to change this to speaker so that y'all can see more of the screen. I am a folklorist. I direct the Louisiana Folklife program, which is in the state arts agency here. So I am a state employee, but I'm also from Louisiana. So our environmental issues are nothing new for me. I remember hearing about our football field of land disappearing every X minutes, hours, days, you know, as it changed over the years since the 70s. But this didn't really come home to me until really 2016, when we had an extreme precipitation event. And for the first time in my life, I thought I might have to evacuate. This was totally unexpected for most of us. The extreme precipitation was a huge area of South Louisiana. One community got 36 inches of rain in 18 hours. And places flooded that had never flooded before. So that set me on this path of thinking about this. And I ended up really focusing up on how this affects our cultures. What's going to happen to our cultures as people, the population displacement increases, because it's not like it's just starting now. This is nothing new. People in South Louisiana have been experimenting with communities and location and places, you know, for 500 years. And even before European contact, the native peoples moved around quite a bit because the river moved around quite a bit. But I like to start my workshops off by asking y'all some guiding questions. And this is simply something for you to think about and consider, because this is what we're going to address in this workshop. So with climate migration increasing within the United States, what should we be doing now? Because some areas this is impacting, like South Louisiana, And some of it will be affecting you eventually, no matter where you are in the country. How can we help migrating communities sustain their cultures? And third, how can we help communities welcome newcomers? So that's kind of where I am, what I think about a lot. Just to give you a couple of basics about culture. Culture is passed on through gatherings and education. It can be formal or informal, but it's people getting together. That's the basis of culture being shared. You have to have somebody to share it with. And so what can we do now to make sure that our culture and our sense of place is passed on? I don't know about y'all, but in Louisiana in general, we like to talk a lot about how important our culture is. But that doesn't mean it gets the type of support or external support, but people love to talk about our culture. We like to talk about our culture, and other people like to come and share our culture. But with disruption coming, we will need to pass on culture with intention. Now, you may wonder why we should focus on cultural changes when there are so many other critical issues, such as flooding and poverty. My answer is that our sense of place, our culture, gives us a sense of well-being and connection that very few other aspects in our lives do. So it's really important to also think about culture and with all the changes that are happening. Now, migration and cultural changes are nothing new. Human history is one of migration. So there were no government programs or nonprofits when the Huns were crossing Asia into Europe, but all of that is good examples of migration. So why do we need to think about this now? And why not just let it happen? It's because now we see it coming, and we have the tools and resources to help it and make sure that what we want to be passed on is passed on. We don't have to be passive. And I believe that the communities that focus on the people and their sense of well-being are more likely to thrive. So the people thrive and the communities thrive. So right now, I want you to start thinking like a future ancestor. I want each of you to think about one thing that you want your great-great-grandchildren to know about their culture or community. Now you can put this in the chat. So have y'all thought about something that you really want to have been passed down to your great-great-grandchildren? Okay, keep that in mind during this workshop. So first, we're going to explore why we're here and what's the situation now. Now, I understand that y'all all are probably generally aware of climate change. I don't go into the science at all. I look at, and I actually don't go into climate mitigation. I've completely focused on climate adaptation and specifically cultural adaptation. So the odds are that this group may already know this, but I always want to make sure. Now, mitigation is where you stop the climate change. So that deals with the science. Adaptation is learning to live with the changes. Now, both are necessary, and they are not mutually exclusive. Now, in the next 10 years, they're predicting major changes. And I don't think the general population is aware of this. Some of them are going to be environmental changes, but while I won't go into it, I like to point out that there are major economic changes that are happening. The environmental changes, these are all the changes that are happening due to the climate. I tend to focus on sea level rise impact because that's what's the primary impact on Louisiana, and that's the research I'm going to share with you is generally about sea level rise, but there are droughts, wildfires, extreme precipitation, stronger storms, tornadoes, and thawing permafrost. Now, the economic changes that are predicted are supposed to be comparable to the Industrial Revolution in half the time. All the technology and the shifting away from the petrochemical industry and fossil fuels is going to make a whole lot of changes on top of the environmental changes. So there are workforce changes related to migration, is the remote work increasing. And while I won't go into this, I like to also mention that all of this migration is going to change the tax base of many communities, whether that's it crashes and there hardly is no tax base, or it dramatically increases because those are the communities that people are moving to. Now I'd like you to get a piece of paper, any size, it doesn't matter. This is just a little exercise to help personalize this. So I'd like you to draw a rectangle and then 6 lines so that you have 7 vertical rectangles in the larger one. Now I'm going to ask you these questions, and if your answer is yes, fill in one of the rectangles. Have you ever experienced extreme weather? Have you ever been concerned about trees falling on your house? Have you ever had your house flooded? I guess for some of y'all, burned. Have you ever had roof damage from a storm? Have you ever had to rebuild your home? Evacuated for a weather event? Or lost family photos in a weather event? Now, I'm wondering if you have one or none or all 7. In South Louisiana, there are a lot of people that would have filled out all 7 of these blocks, have answered yes. So the point of this exercise is to start personalizing this and imagining the impact all of these events has on the people that are directly impacted by it. So they are going to be taking some of this trauma, they're either staying in their community with this trauma, and sometimes recurring traumas, or they're taking it with them to another community. I'd like you to consider, just in general, do you think you are more at risk now than in a few years ago? Now, in Louisiana, we also talk about these 3 questions. And I realize that in large parts of the country, it hadn't gotten to this point. And I'm assuming y'all are from all over the country. But we talk a lot about, will you stay or will you move only if you have to? Are you ready to move? And very importantly for me, which really motivated me to start thinking about this as part of my profession and not just on a personal level, is do you know where you would go if you moved? Now, this is one of the many predictions. I don't worry about which prediction is more likely than the next prediction, because most of it is just when. This is the direction that we're heading, and exactly when we get there is what is debated. But you'll see all the counties in blue will lose land to the ocean. The red counties will see increased migration. And the darker the red, the more people they will receive. Now, we do have some white counties out in the west. But then remember that this is only migration due to sea level rise. So that's not taking into consideration extreme drought or wildfires. So that's all of those are on top of the research that I'm sharing with you. Now, migration is a huge, vast area of research. A lot of geographers have been looking at migration for many years, so there's a vast body of research. This is by Matthew Hauer out of the University of Florida. And this is a graphic that helps you understand where people are going to move. He used address changes on tax returns to predict where people are going to move. And so clockwise, you have the states with the most people moving at all down. And then if you see the big, large blue here, this is Florida. All of the blue is Florida. And all of this section means the number of people who are moving within Florida. Then this is the people who are leaving Florida. And if you'll see, you follow this, Texas is the destination of more Floridians than any other location. But you can see how they span out all over. And in Louisiana, what I try to do is also point out that Florida, Texas, New York, and California have significantly larger populations than Louisiana. So we are one of the states that are going to be most profoundly impacted. But what's notable is most people in Louisiana will stay in Louisiana. And the state that will receive the most Louisianans is Texas. Texas is going to receive a lot of people. So again, we ask, what do we need to be doing now to address the human dimension in planning? And I ask this question again in this way, because this is the jargon of the planners. And so the human dimension is everything that's not the physical land. You know, it's not building levees, it's not planting mangroves. But human dimension is much more than culture. It includes things like land use policies, mental health very significantly. And what we are saying we need to do is we need to include culture in the community resilience conversation. And that phrase, community resilience conversation, is known within the planning world about this. So a lot of my workshops, I'm talking to people who are not necessarily involved in the planning conversations and helping them learn the jargon, the language of the planners. it can also be referred to as professional adaptations or adaptation professionals. And by the way, all of my work is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, Division of the Arts. So, Louisiana Response. Back in 2018, the Louisiana Folklore Society realized that they really wanted to facilitate a dialogue about getting culture included in the conversation. I was the first one to respond with the Louisiana Folklife program, and what I have been funding since then is workshops by traditional masters to teach their tradition within their own community. And so that's supporting what can be called the collapsing communities or the sending communities. Again, I'm sharing language with you that you might use with planners, but you wouldn't necessarily use with community members, because community members do not want to have their community referred to as a collapsing community. The second type of workshop is what I'm doing here, called a sense of place and loss workshop, where I'm helping people become more aware of the issues and trying to infuse or pull the arts and culture network into the planning conversations. And then most recently, the Louisiana Folklore Society started what they call the Bayou Culture gatherings. And those are Zoom gatherings to bring together people who are concerned about all this. And we're just delighted that the response has been so much more than we ever imagined, and they're already working towards policy recommendations. So this is how Louisiana has responded. And the Bayou Culture Collaborative says these are the things that we need to be doing now. We need to support the cultures of coastal communities, include the cultural voices in coastal planning, engage the arts and culture network, mobilize and support artists to help people better understand coastal crises and recognize that these are statewide issues, and prepare communities to welcome newcomers. Now, we're very adamant that we do not have all the answers. We do not promote specific adaptation strategies. And most importantly is we do not encourage people to leave or to stay. And after I go through the relocation section, I think you'll understand more about that. But we do want to provide a forum for everyone to explore these issues and consider actions. And I'm delighted to say that we're already having an impact. So my question to you, is this news to you? Have you, your family, or friends considered relocating? Leonisa, I'm not sure how you want to do this. Would you like me to stop sharing and have a discussion?
Why don't we see if people want to drop things in the chat, and then I can read some of them out, and then we can stop share if people want to talk about it. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah. So you're asking specifically like about relocating, but for climate reasons, right? Because some of us do think about moving, but you're saying specifically around climate, or?
Good point. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm talking about has the climate changes impacted you yet? Mm-hmm. And then the second question, is this news to you? I'm thinking it probably isn't to this group. I frequently talk to groups that this is not something that they've thought about, the idea of relocating due to climate.
Okay.
And so just in the last couple of years, there's been so much more news about this. I think awareness is starting to build.
Yeah. And we're seeing, so some people are, considering it, but not to climate change, maybe for political reasons. Stacy's saying we've not considered relocating, but we are anticipating a strong migration of people locating here due to fresh water access, because she's on the shores of Lake Superior in northern Wisconsin. In the Pacific Northwest, Gary is telling us that they are a climate refugee destination, Washington State in specific. people think about escaping extreme cold weather, but that could be also extreme weather, if I may, Ned, go from there. Becca adds, here in Anchorage, we have more midwinter thawing that leads to very icy conditions. I think about needing to move when I'm an old person because it's just so hard to get around on the ice. Noella says that friends of hers have considered it, but she has not herself. Rob says, yes, my partner and I, both young adults, moved to northern Maine last year in large part for climate reasons. And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, great. So some of y'all are already thinking about it. And again, we want to acknowledge that different parts of the country are impacted in different ways, but this issue is coming to you if it hasn't already, to all locations. So now I want to talk about migration and relocation issues. Again, they vary dramatically. I've put this out here just because I want you to be aware of it. That I'm not going to go into detail, but the level of risk, the economics, the demographics are things that planners get involved with, and that's beyond things like, you know, is the sewer infrastructure in a community big enough to, you know, can it handle the capacity of new people coming? So there are all kind of other issues, but I'm going to focus in on the cultural ones. Now in Louisiana, people, we talk about moving up the bayou, that people don't even cross over to the next bayou, they move up the bayou. But whether or not people are likely to move to the next higher ground or farther away is definitely related to the cultural traditions of the state, of the area, and it's related to how long they've lived in the area for generations, or have they more recently arrived. So if you're talking about somebody that's, you know, 7 generations, and there are a few places that actually have 7 generations on the same land in South Louisiana, or a Baton Rouge suburb where somebody moved 5 years ago to for a job, you know, they have different levels of ties to both the culture and the place. So you would need to determine, wherever you are, how tied people are to place. And then there's another layer that you add to that, and that's whether or not they will have to leave one ecosystem for another. And in Louisiana, that's we like to talk a lot about the people who can walk out their backyard and catch their dinner, you know, fresh crabs or, you know, whatever, and have it that, you know, they're catching dinner. And that really does happen. So if they have to leave, and it doesn't take too far for that to be a dramatic change. And that will also relate to food insecurity, because when so much of your diet is based on what you've harvested or grown in your new location, you're switching over to cash economy and until your garden gets reestablished, but then you can't bring the bayou with you. So these are cultural issues that are tied to relocating. Now, the different terms related to migration. Means migration is what is primarily done in Louisiana now. There's only one case and has gotten national attention of managed retreat, the Ile de Jean Charles, if y'all might be aware of that, because it's gotten so much national attention. But means migration simply means that those who can leave do leave. And what ends up happening is the young adults and the middle class are leave, and that leaves the elderly and the poor, people who can't leave. So by not addressing this problem now, we're creating worse problems in the future. And then the wealthy, of course, can take care of themselves. They have the money to either rebuild or relocate, or, you know. Now, managed retreat is a very sensitive subject practically anywhere. And there are two aspects that get people really upset. One, retreat is seen as giving up and letting others or the climate win. It's a military term, remember. But then also managed is a problem for a lot of people, because like, who's managing it? So the state is managing it. Who's going to be telling me what to do, what I have to do? And within the professional adaptation world, they've come up with a lot of ways to communicate this without using those words. One of the most common is assisted relocation, but there's a long list of them. Now, chain migration means you're following family and friends, and that's you have second and third tier chain migration. And a lot of this comes from the immigrant studies of immigrants. Now, forced migration is where you're just absolutely forced to move. You're told you have to go. But Monique Verdun, a Houma Indian from extreme South Louisiana, she has participated in some of my workshops, and she has talked about how there's another option, and that's retreat and return. And sometimes it's retreat and return and retreat and return. And historically, a lot of indigenous people actually did this. They knew that the Mississippi River flooded, and but they would go out either part of the year and come back to higher ground for the other parts of or a few years here, a few years there. So there are different ways. So there are lots of options here. There's not just one way this has to be done. So let's talk about what prompts people to move. A lot of people think, okay, after a hurricane, why in the world doesn't everybody just leave? Well, in general, people are not motivated to move after a weather event. And it's a complicated set of factors. It's not a simple thing. The decision to move is highly personal and more about family and when they are ready. Now, for anyone, the most common reasons to move is for a job offer or to be near family. But when people move are more related to personal transitions. It's children starting school or the children are graduating. Well, when I retire, and then our physical changes. I can't get up the stairs anymore, so I need to move. Now, some of these houses that have been elevated, a few slides back, I showed you one of the elevated houses, and some of them have elevators because they're so tall. They're like 16 feet up. But not everybody gets the elevator, and so that's quite a walk up the stairs. But also the community starts to change. As people start moving away, the people who remain cannot support as many businesses. So businesses start to close. But again, it's still a personal decision about when to move. Is like, how far are you willing to drive to get grocery or gas? Now, I know out west, people are used to driving much farther distances routinely, but so this is all dependent on the particular culture of that location. Now in Louisiana, there's some more questions that some more factors that are becoming real. And they have been for a while, it's just not as well known until more recently. But especially with the flood insurance changes, there are large areas that you're not even going to be able to get flood insurance, so you're on your own. The banks have been pulling out of quite a few areas, and you cannot get a mortgage or homeowners insurance in quite a few areas. And that line just keeps creeping north. So now I'd like you to think about, is your community a receiving or sending community, or both? Because today's receiving community might be tomorrow's sending community. So if y'all would put in chat your thoughts about this.
So I'll read some of the things that are coming in. We're seeing quite a few receiving, a couple of boths, more than a few boths. Oh, and this is an interesting one. Ned writes, like on Long Island, the North Shore tends to be receiving and the South Shore is sending, which is very interesting. Bruce thought that New York was both, and Stevie adds to that, it's hard to know because New York City is so climate precarious, yet so many people come here for jobs and family. And I know a few folks in both the American Pacific Northwest and the Canadian are saying receiving. But someone notes the expensive, right? How expensive it is to live there. So receiving, but yeah, with the prohibitions, I guess, some of both, some of both. And then someone wrote a neither, which I'm curious about. So maybe Joe wants to share. We could talk a little more about that. And I see also Harvey said something, economically, we send people away, but we could be a receiver. So it's an interesting mix.
Okay, and we're gonna have time to when I finish with the slides, we'll have time to discuss all of this. So the next section is about the receiving communities. And at first I really focused on welcoming climate migrants, but it became apparent that really what we're talking about is welcoming newcomers, whether or not they're coming because of climate reasons, or whether or not they're refugees or immigrants. And both of those areas, well, especially the immigrant and refugees, there's another vast body of research about that. And so some of the things that I'm going to share with you come from immigrant research and some from the much more recent climate migration research. So again, why be proactive? The bottom line is that there is going to be conflict between the long-term residents and the newcomers. And this can be outright hostility or more reserved, like right now in Baton Rouge, we have the next parish over is called Livingston Parish. And it's part of the larger North Shore, what's called the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And it is basically filling in. And this was rural areas. We have developers coming in and putting big subdivisions in there. And right now in today's newspaper, it's about the long-term residents being upset that this new subdivision is being built and all it's going to do is make flooding worse. Now, sometimes, since the older the neighborhood, the higher the ground, at least here, I would think it would be similar in other types of ecosystems. But, the higher ground are the more historic areas. And so the high ground generally has already been taken. And so these new developments are frequently in floodplains, but they're, not permitting them to build depends on your laws, your zoning, and things like that. And this particular parish really prided itself on very little zoning. And now they have no argument for prohibiting a new subdivision from being built in, even though they don't want it to be. But very importantly is there are known strategies to help newcomers and long-term residents adjust. One of the most important strategies is what's called an artist community engagement project. And that's where you bring together the newcomers and the long-term residents so they get to know each other. Now, this can be in all kinds of different projects related to, and this is coming out of immigration research that I'm going to put in the chat afterwards, all the citations that I'm going to share with you. But related to this is the artist engagement projects need to focus on traditions, or at least include traditions as assets, as cultural assets. And so the art world, some parts of the art world don't necessarily embrace the traditional arts as much as they do the more formally trained artists. There's a place for both of them. But there is an argument, especially with immigrants, is that in other parts of the world, they don't make such a distinction as we do between our traditions and the formal art. That they, that's new to them to come here and find out that that's two different conversations at times. Not everywhere, but often. So this booklet I'll show you in a minute encourages you to, if you're designing a project, to use the traditions that are more easily shared and accepted. So foodways, of course, is one of the most important ones. Traditional ecological knowledge, TEK is a phrase that is used worldwide in the planning world and the environmental world too. And that's things like foraging, fishing, all the living off the land. But quilting and different types of fiber work are also recommended. And then of course, storytelling. Now, we don't have a time to go into all the different types. In my longer workshop that focuses just on this, I go into this a lot more, in a lot more detail. The other thing is you can learn from the strategies that immigrants have used to make sure that their children retain their culture in the face of being westernized. If you have any Chinese at all in your community, you have a Chinese culture school. There are many different types of camps, culture camps, where the children can learn what it is to be Lao or Chinese or any of the cultures. Then there are cultural centers. And a lot of immigrants have community gardens because they couldn't get the vegetables at the grocery store that they wanted. That's changing now, with the food distribution, our avocados come from Mexico all the time, but it may not be the exact variety that they want. That there's still a lot of foods, and especially vegetables, that are not readily accessible. Now, these are two of the books that I draw on. Arts Place America was a project that came sunset. It was a 10-year initiative, And their last field scan was called Bridging Divides, Creating Community, Arts, Culture, and Immigration. And the strategies that I just mentioned came out of that book. Another good one is you should know about Welcoming America. That's an organization that is about helping refugees and immigrants integrate into U.S. society. Art of Community came out of the folklore world. This is creativity at the crossroads of immigrant cultures and social services. I highly recommend this one because it has such excellent case studies to really dig down and really get at good ideas of how these projects can happen. And now this particular book was more about immigrants, and they were talking to social services people, but it is all of these other, the immigration and resources, it's very easily to translate that into climate migration too. Now, there are a few things that I want to point out that are more cautionary. And I'll quickly go through this so we have enough time to visit. It's very important to take what's called an intersectional viewpoint. This is a map out of Dean Hardy Dean's work, and I'll put this citation in the chat afterwards. All of the counties in gray have a higher percentage of African Americans than the national average. So this gets into some of the cultural equity issues related to climate or climate equity. Because if you don't pay attention to intersectional, you're going to end up replicating the patterns of the past. So intersectionality refers to race, class, and gender systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So because they generally lived in the lower land, they are more likely to be displaced due to flooding. I don't know how this works out with some of the other parts, some of the other climate change things like drought. I don't know if the land settlement had that type of bias into it. So when a community says that they are going to be colorblind and not take this into consideration, they will be replicating these patterns. Now, words matter. I've alluded to a few of these, and there are certain words that get people very upset. And resilience in South Louisiana is one of them. People are very tired of being told they have to be resilient. And this is especially true for African American communities, because being told you have to be resilient is generally heard as you're on your own. You've got to figure this out. The old bootstrap argument. I've already talked about managed retreat and how that can be a trigger, and I've alluded to collapsing communities. Nobody wants their community to be called collapsing. So depending on who you're talking to, you need to consider whether or not the words you're using are going to end up making people even worse. It used to be that you couldn't say climate change. When I first started this several years ago, I was very cautious about saying the phrase climate change. And now that is not an issue anymore. But if it is an issue in your area, what I was advised is that you don't talk about climate change, you talk about the results. You talk about storms and flooding. and that is not a trigger. Let's see. Now, this is an excellent booklet that came out of the climate migration conversation, that there's an organization that they combine those two words, and it's called the Climate Migration Network. And they developed this resource that is really good. Lead with Listening, a guidebook for community conversations on climate. And basically, they're telling you to approach people as experts of their lived experience. And this is whether or not they're long-term residents or newcomers. That you first listen, you lead with questions, you have to build trust, build relationships. And very cool is it even has exercises to use with groups. And all of these are online. I'll give you links to the online. Now, when I'm talking to people who are likely to have these, to use these strategies, like arts administrators or Main Street managers, Main Street program managers, I like to emphasize that I'm not asking you to do anything dramatically different, but to look at these strategies through the lens of climate migration and the issues. So you just have to be a little bit more sensitive and factor in some things that you may not have otherwise done. And trauma-informed care is one of those. I would never expect people that are organizing these types of things, the community leaders, to be trauma-informed practitioners. That is a whole profession, and it's advanced training. What I'm encouraging people to do is to make sure that you have somebody that can advise you about how you're designing things and implementing them. And in some time, and depending on what you're doing, is to have somebody trained on site that is aware of what's happening, so that they can bring this expertise to it. Basically, especially the newcomers, or in the collapsing communities, the long-term residents, they're traumatized. And they may have layers of trauma. If y'all aren't familiar with ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, this factors into trauma-informed approaches, where the more adverse childhood experiences you have, as an adult, you're going to have that much less coping mechanisms and trauma. So they may have been treated for it. They may have, in different levels of recovery. But basically, when you're getting into these traumatized communities, you don't know who's standing in front of you and what kind of trauma they have experienced. So you need to have this incorporated into your strategies. So now, taking action. Here are a few ideas of for you to consider. Some of this I think y'all already know. Some of it I've given you a certain amount of introduction to, but what are your state's climate change policies and adaptation strategies? I've introduced you to a little bit of their jargon, of the adaptation professionals' jargon. Very important to understand intersectionality and trauma-informed strategies, but also identify the players in your particular area. What are the state and federal agencies, environmental groups, cultural researchers, activists, that could be part of your network? Now, in Louisiana, I don't know all, every how every state does it. I do know that some states like Louisiana do have state master plans. North Carolina, I know, has. I don't know where all the other states are. So you would need to figure out if there is a master plan in place. There may not be. You would need to know the different federal agencies. These are the ones that are in Louisiana, and I have no idea whether or not they are also in your area. Sea grant universities, there are 34 in coastal states, and they do consider the Great Lakes coastal states. This is out of NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And also, if you have a national estuary program, there are 28 on the coast. That those could be key partners. So now basically this is the end, and so I'm going to ask you, what can you do to start to address climate adaptation and or climate migration? So I'm going to stop sharing. And we can have a conversation until, oh good, we have 30 minutes left. We have almost 30 minutes left. So this can be whatever you need it to be. I'm going to add some things in the chat that are the resources I mentioned. So how would y'all like to do
I guess
this?
maybe if folks either physically raise their hand or use the raise hand reaction, and what we could do is put you like in a side-by-side spotlight with Maida if you want to ask a question or have a reflection. I think it sounds like a good plan. Does that work for everybody to try that? Okay, and I'll try to catch all the hands. So we'll start with William. Oh,
I was muted. Okay, now I'm up.
Mhm.
This has been a very useful review of a lot of things, particularly with regard to flooding. In the West, we have wildfires, and there would be some different adaptation strategies and migration effects. For example, we have communities in the state of Washington that have burned to the ground. And basically, one of the strategies has to be zoning the wild urban interface to make it much less treacherous for people to live there. And that runs into a lot of resistance, as you can imagine. So some people are forced to migrate because they lose their homes in a fire. And now we're going to have to establish new communities. And a lot of the strategies you described would work in these conditions. I want to thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, I haven't, again, I was not an environmental, I mean, my sympathies were there, but I would not describe myself as an environmental activist before this. And so I have not gotten into that kind of issue of the wild and urban interface. That's something I hadn't really thought much about in relationship to this work.
I think primarily, as with any problem, especially problems we don't want to deal with, like the climate emergency, we've got to talk about it to friends, family, community leaders and decision makers, to alert them that we can not stand by and let this happen to us, but we have to be proactive, as Bill indicated, with things like zoning. anticipating retreat from urban wild interfaces or buffers in that case. But here in Washington State, we're thinking about managed retreat. But first and foremost, it's talking about it, making people aware, I think.
Well, one thing I didn't mention is that a good way to not get reelected is to even say the word, managed retreat. That is like 99% probability. There are a lot of interesting studies from California about how, somebody came in and we're going to do this, and they don't get reelected because people do not want to think about this.
Well, like the North Carolina legislature banned the term sea level rise
Oh my gosh.
to protect the building industry. And, but I'm not talking about that level. I'm talking about us as individuals making it a thing. At every opportunity we have to bring this up. And the other thing we have to mention is the other 800-pound gorilla in the room is population overshoot. Especially in North America, we've got a huge carbon footprint. And now, at this point, it's important to realize for people in childbearing age that what the future for their children will probably not be a place of great joy, to put it mildly. And their children may, probably not, but tend to curse them for not considering these things with all we know.
Well, that's the importance of helping people think like future ancestors. That might influence some, I guess. I might be overly optimistic, but that's why I focus on the, think like a future ancestor.
Thanks, Gary, and thank you so far, Maida. I think, Joe, you have your hand up. Yes, come on over.
Yeah, my problem is, I think, a little different. My immediate problem here is that people are not awake. I'm finding my neighbors, my community, they feel almost removed from the problems. I'm in a higher elevation of New Jersey. We have serious problems at the shore, but those tend to be the vacation houses, The people around me feel relatively protected. We have problems with power outages because we have a lot of trees. So they just go out and buy a generator and they feel everything is fine. My town itself doesn't have a river. It has lots of streams, lots of lakes, but we don't feel like we're going to flood here. We do hear about floods nearby, but a lot of people are on remote work because we don't have too many laborers in town because we're a relatively comfortable economically town. So it's like, wake up. The supply chain I worry about. We're not, in this part of the state, we don't really grow a lot of our own food. So once that supply chain breaks, it could be hard to have normal, food delivered to where we are. My concern really has to do with the permafrost, which is so far away, but it's the one thing that we can't get a handle on, we don't see it. And I'm concerned about the diseases that are going to be, that are being released, the microbes that are being released that we've never encountered before, and we don't know how to deal with it. We know how to deal with, you know, French drains, if we need French drains, or storm windows, or tornado shelters. But melting permafrost is a new kind of problem, and I'm a little worried about that.
Well, I'd like to point out that about the people that aren't awake.
Yeah.
Being able to deal with this is actually a form of privilege.
Yeah.
That most people, and this is like, and this is typical of people in the extremes, on the extreme coast, you know, really, that, and also we're talking about different types of coast. I didn't go into that part of the workshop. That the issues with recreational coast is different than working coast. We have a working coast.
Right.
So you have people of all income levels living on land that is sometimes submerged. But on a day-to-day basis, they're just going to work and, you know, trying to make a living and get the kids to school and doing all the normal daily stuff, that it is a real privilege to even be able to sit here and talk about all this.
Oh, yeah. I'm very well aware of that. My heart goes out to those shellfish people who live their lives, you know, collecting shellfish every day after that BP oil spill, and they've been told to get on with their lives, and they still can't. I know what happened down there. You know, it's awful.
Yes.
We have some problem. I mean, we have problems at the shore, and there are working people there who live there year round, and they are struggling. There's no doubt about that. But if we're talking about my immediate community, you know, my section, my part of the state, we don't encounter a whole lot other than some power outages because of trees, mostly, I would say. Some flooding in those communities that have good sized rivers. So you might have the, you know, usually the lower income live around those rivers. And it happens year after year, you know. Yeah.
So Joe, your points are well taken, and it makes me think of what Gary was saying too, is like, how do we, especially as, you know, here we are, a faith community gathered here together. How do we think about presentations or conversations we can have? So maybe that's something we can continue over the course of the week, to talking to each other in our small groups about raising awareness about people who don't see immediate effects, right? That's definitely a big part of it. Yep. Mm-hmm. And I see Ned has his hand up. So I'm going to trade you out, Joe, for Ned, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I actually, it's building on what you just said. Namely, I'd like to, from Maida, to ask her, is there a role that you think a faith community, a congregation could play in a community to be a bridge builder or some sort of cultural sustaining agent? Are there particular strengths that religious communities might be bringing to this enterprise?
I'll be perfectly honest with you. I haven't gotten that far in my thought process about some of these. I have talked with my own minister, Nathan Ryan, and because we're sitting here living with it, and he asked me, and I said, I really don't know. And then I thought, I think the most important thing he could do is help equip people with coping strategies. At this point, that's where I am in it. I know UUs, and again, I'm speaking as a UU, that we tend to want to go save those people over there. so what do we need to be doing in our own community, our own church and such? So that's not to say that you don't have public programs. You know, certainly you could have, you know, speaker series and do things like that. But just remember to speak to your own church and not, you know, your own congregation and not those other people. Because there are issues. If you're not a sending community now, you're going to be a receiving community, at least for a while. And I tend to jump ahead 20 years. Like one time, you know, all these levees were building and planting mangroves, all of that. One of the state agency people in charge of all that told me, we're just buying 20 years. We're spending all that money and all we're doing is saving, you know,
Postponing the inevitable.
yeah.
Mhm.
But nobody wants to hear that. And so no, you know, people they won't publicly say that. So, but still, what could your community be doing and not the people down the road to prepare yourself for all these people coming? Because they're coming.
You might see if there's an Interfaith Power and Light chapter in your state. They are doing great work. It's an interdenominational organization, and also our own UU Ministry for the Earth is on the front lines of this issue, connecting to them. The
Yeah.
Indigenous Environmental Network
Mhm.
Are they
is another
focused
one.
on mitigation or adaptation or?
Well, all of it. They are, well, the question was, you know, what's going on with the faith-based community?
Yeah.
Well, here in UU Ministry for the Earth is all about this issue.
Right.
And so is Interfaith Power and Light. It's one of the, well, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, it's one of their key areas. So it's not a faith-based organization.
And I would add Green Faith to that as well, Gary. Between UU's as an organization, Interfaith Power and Light, Ministry for Earth, Green Faith. And that's where I was going to go after Ned asked that question and you jumped in, because I was thinking that, I think to your point, Maida, it's excellent that we do it in our community, not to do the classic, how can we, right? What, like a learning and right. But partnering, like, you know, compassionately, understandingly, learningly, which is a made up word, partnering. And I think doing that with our interfaith siblings is one way of making that happen, because then it's not just like, I just think because there might be communities who are more connected to other communities, right? And we don't necessarily draw, you know, a diverse type, right? In general, right? And so if we're part of interfaith networks, then we might cover more bases. We might be able to address that intersectionality you were talking to us about. You might actually think we might actually be able to find partners and then be conduits. I know I'm part of two interfaith groups up where I live, and we get meetings with county agents and city agents and state agents, because we have this kind of power of our moral authority, for lack of a better way to put it, right? But people do want to hear from clergy. So there is something really impactful about connecting with interfaith organizations and groups and creating coalitions, basically, right? But I appreciate you bringing up Ministry for Earth, absolutely. And that's why, IPLs, and that's why I also throw in Green Faith. And it looks like Noella and Lyndon are throwing some interesting stuff in the chat here. Lyndon, this is okay. I think that especially living in a big city with skyrocketing housing prices, affordable housing and social programs are really important for welcoming newcomers. I've been thinking a lot about rich people with big homes and so much unnecessary space. Maybe there should be more programs for hosting refugees in people's homes, affordable housing that is closer to downtown core, and important cultural and social services. Excellent point. Lyndon, do you want to I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to say more, or is it okay that we just read it, or do you want to join the screen with us? Because I think you make excellent points.
I don't know what else I could add to that. But yeah, I feel like just, thinking a lot about, living in a big city and being a person with a lot of privilege, and even, I think I had a conversation with Leonisa and our Traj Learn team a long time ago,
Yeah.
and thinking about people like me who are moving to go to university, and then we'll have like an empty room in my house, potentially, welcoming people who need a home to that space, and having that be a way for people to have more like affordable housing, just like as an example.
Yeah.
So thinking about all those strategies, and also just, like going through that personal journey of being more, like accepting of like other people coming into your, like welcoming people into like your close family circle.
Yeah.
Who really need support.
Yeah, I remember that conversation because we were talking about something we're trying to pass in our county that is actually making progress about, I forgot the title of it now, but if you have a garage or an apartment, or how we start doing more home sharing kind of things, to what we were talking about. And I think it's a model for how we welcome people into the community, right? To other conversation, instead of it being people coming in and we're going to give them an area of town. It's more like people are coming in and they're going to live with longtime residents already. And so it becomes a way of creating community where maybe there might have been conflict or tension. So I'm glad you wrote that in the chat. Thanks, Lyndon. Yeah. We have a few more minutes. I see. Oh, good. Thank you. Becca raised her hand.
Hi. So I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, and the the situation, in a lot of communities out in the rural, what we call the rural area, parts of Alaska, out on the coast, especially, are, whole communities, villages that are, that are mostly, if not entirely, Alaska Native people, that are, that are looking at relocating the entire community because, because of erosion or rising sea level. And so it's a little bit different than what you're talking about. It's not like people leaving to go join another community. It's the whole community trying to stay intact and move to a location, to higher ground. And I'm not an expert in it. I just wanted to bring that into the conversation. And I guess I'm kind of curious.
That would be managed retreat, better called assisted relocation. Like in our working groups, immediately one of the things, we're working out principles that we want to recommend, and communities need access to resources to be able to move together and retain their culture. I didn't use in this presentation an example that I often do is, Baton Rouge is, a medium-sized city, lots of suburbs, dispersed settlement. There are only a few that are really, like there's a Vietnamese area, there's a few Latino areas, but most of it is very dispersed. And one of the Houma Indians mentioned that there are all these Houma Indians living in Baton Rouge, and I had no idea. I'm a state folklorist. I just finished 5 years of documenting the tradition, communities in Baton Rouge. Had no idea that they were even here. So I said, do they gather somewhere? Do they go to a church? Do they, is there a leader? Are they in a certain part of town? None of the above. Well, that is the perfect way to lose your culture. If you don't gather and share, you're going to lose it. And so one of the things that the welcoming communities can do is to help connect them. Like, is there a way to help them connect? Now, I'm going to end up, I'm working with the tribe because they have the tribal people have a list, and either you're on the list or you're not. And so they can contact people. And so one of the projects that we want to develop in the next few years is a way to help the Houma Indians in Baton Rouge connect. So that's one of the things that another thing that a receiving community can do to help the newcomers, because they can't even necessarily find each other. The larger the city, the more difficult it'll be. Yeah. Unless they all go to a certain, apartment complex. Like I know there's one apartment complex where most of the Turks live.
Mhm.
If they're in apartments, but once they get into homes, then they're dispersed. So.
Right. Well, we are, I think, at our time, because I know we're coming back in a half hour for our keynote. I hope everyone will join me in thanking Maida for this wonderful, very informative, so much information. And I hope that folks will continue to have these conversations. And we know we'll talk about it in our small groups. And I hope everybody knows how to save the chat. And if not, we'll of course make sure we get everything to you. But if you save the chat, there's all those wonderful resources. So if we can all, offer our gratitude. Thank you. Thank you. And yes, I'm so grateful that you were able to join us. This worked out wonderfully.
That worked out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So we'll see you in 30 minutes. And Maida, I'm not sure I sent you the link for the keynote. So if you want it, I'll send it in an email to you right now.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, everyone, we're going to close it down and we'll see you in a little bit. Thank you so much.
Okay.